Sharpening your Spokeshave blade isn't much different than sharpening a garden variety hand plane iron, with the exception that the small blades are difficult to hold in a typical honing guide. That's why furniture maker Chris Gochner came up with this custom jig for his Spokeshave irons. With the blade mounted in this jig, it's easy to grind and hone a perfect edge using standard sharpening techniques. And because it's double-ended, it can handle both short bevel-up style blades and longer bevel-down types. It's nothing more than a hardwood scrap with slots cut in each end. Your Spokeshave irons fit into the slot, and the wing nuts are used to tighten them in place. To make it even easier to use, Gochner mounts a fender washer to the top side. You can use this to attach the magnetic base of an angle gauge. Here's how it works. Begin by milling a piece of hardwood to size. A 2" by 5" piece works great for most Spokeshave irons. Use a tenon jig to cut a slot in each end of the workpiece, 1½ deep and as thick as the blade they'll hold. An 1/8" slot worked for me, but thinner irons might require a thin curved blade. To create clearance for grinding and honing the bevel, tilt the saw blade to 25 degrees and cut a bevel on the underside. Drill and countersink holes for the 2 clamping screws in each end of the jig. The screws will also serve as a depth stop to keep the blade square with the holder, so make sure they're parallel with the ends. Different irons have different measurements. That's why the screws on one end of my jig are further from the edge than the opposite side. To allow the top halves of the slots to tighten freely under the wing nuts, set your depth stop so you don't go all the way through, and use a larger bit than the screw threads to re-drill the holes. Now, use a Forstner bit to drill a shallow mortise that will accept the fender washer. Add a bit of glue under the fender washer and the screw heads to keep them from rotating in their sockets as you thread the wing nuts into place. Now it's time for a test drive. Sharpening begins with flattening the back of the blade. If the back isn't flat, Gochner recommends lapping it and working your way up from 220 grit sandpaper all the way up to 2000. Once the back is flat and polished, you can move on to the grinding phase. Begin by mounting the blade in the holder with the bevel face down. Now set the grinder's tool rest to the appropriate angle. For bevel down blades, Gochner recommends a 25-degree primary bevel and 30-degree secondary bevel. For bevel up blades, he goes with a 20-degree primary and 25-degree secondary bevel. Now grind the angle, making sure the edge is straight and square to the blade's side. Mount the blade holder into a standard honing guide to tackle the secondary bevel. In this case, I'm setting the angle to 30 degrees. Begin with 150 grit sandpaper to produce a wire edge. After you've formed a burr, switch to water stones and polish the cutting edge, working from 1,000 to 6,000 and finally 13,000. Lastly, flip the blade over and lap the back a bit on your finest stone to get rid of any burr.